He could have been a scientist, a respected professor, standing in front of a blackboard filled with equations, teaching the brightest minds of the future. But fate had a different stage in mind for him. One day, the world would not see him in a lab coat, but as a cold, unshakable machine on the big screen, known to millions as Ivan Drago. Yet behind those piercing eyes and that stone-carved face was a boy from Sweden, fragile and invisible in his own home. How does a shy, uncertain child grow into one of Hollywood's most unforgettable icons? Sometimes a story reminds you of a moment from years ago. Right below, there's a red subscribe button. Click it now, and you won't miss a single one. November 1957. The winds of Stockholm cut sharp against the skin as Dolph Lundgren entered the world. His family home was filled not with warmth, but with rules. His father, a strict former military officer, demanded strength and obedience above all else. His mother was gentler, protective in her own way, but kept a distance that made her love feel untouchable. For young Dolph, childhood was not filled with laughter. He was thin, timid, and quiet, constantly reminded by his father that he wasn't enough. Every insult carved into him a silent vow. One day, I will prove them wrong. He didn't know how, but he knew he would. As he grew, a spark of defiance took root. In high school, Dolph discovered karate. For him, it was more than just a sport. It was survival. Every punch he threw was a word he never dared to say to his father. Every victory on the mat was a rebellion, a whisper to himself, I am not weak. But Dolph wasn't only muscle. Beneath his quiet exterior lived an extraordinary mind. He studied chemical engineering at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and later earned a master's degree at the University of Sydney. Professors saw brilliance, colleagues saw discipline. On paper, he had everything needed for a life of stability and respect. Yet no matter how many books he read or degrees he collected, the emptiness inside never left. In the mirror, the young man staring back at him still looked incomplete. Academic success wasn't enough. It couldn't erase the scars of childhood or silence the voice that whispered, not good enough. That voice would push him away from the safe halls of science and into the unpredictable world of fame and cinema. He was still years away from Hollywood, but the path had already been set. No one in Sweden could have imagined that this quiet, withdrawn boy would one day stand in the ring opposite Rocky Balboa, with the eyes of the entire world upon him. To the audience, he would be Ivan Drago, the ruthless symbol of strength. But for Dolph, it was something far deeper, a chance to finally silence the doubts that had haunted him since childhood. And this was only the beginning. Every great story has a crossroads, the moment when a life meant to follow one path suddenly veers toward another. For Dolph Lundgren, that turning point came not in a laboratory surrounded by formulas, but in a world of flashing lights, music, and chaos, a world he never imagined he would belong to. By the time he reached his 20s, Dolph had already achieved what many would consider a lifetime's worth of success. A master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Sydney, and even more, an offer for a scholarship at MIT, the dream destination for the brightest minds in the world. To his family, to his professors, and to society itself, Dolph was destined to be an academic star. Yet behind that polished image, he was restless. The sterile labs, the endless equations, the silent libraries. They began to feel suffocating. It was as if he was living someone else's life, fulfilling expectations that weren't truly his own. Deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "This isn't who you are meant to be." It was in Sydney that fate intervened. A chance encounter brought him into the orbit of Grace Jones, the magnetic, unpredictable singer and actress whose presence could command a room. Dolph, with his towering physique and quiet intensity, became her bodyguard. But Grace saw something in him far beyond muscle and discipline. She saw potential, a fire that hadn't yet been set free. Their relationship was explosive, passionate, and unrestrained. Grace dragged Dolph into her world of nightclubs, fashion shows, and concerts. For a young man who had grown up in silence and control, it was intoxicating. Suddenly, he was no longer a reserved student of science. He was standing at the edges of fame, feeling its raw energy pulling him closer. Grace pushed him to try acting. At first, Dolph laughed. He wasn't an actor, he was a fighter, a scholar. But then came a small opportunity, a role in the James Bond film A View to a Kill, 1985. It was brief, just a minor part as a KGB guard. But when the camera rolled, something unexpected happened. His presence, his cold, commanding stare, it captured attention. Hollywood had noticed, and then a far bigger chance appeared. Sylvester Stallone was casting for Rocky IV. The role? Ivan Drago, a Soviet powerhouse, silent but deadly, the perfect symbol of Cold War fear. Dolph Lundgren was unknown, inexperienced, and yet when he walked into that audition room, it was as though the role had been waiting for him all along. What he didn't yet realize was that this character would change his life forever. Ivan Drago wasn't just a role. It was the embodiment of every insult from his father, every moment of doubt, every unspoken word that had burned inside him since childhood. The boy who once felt invisible was about to become the face the entire world would never forget. And once the bell rang, in that ring, there would be no turning back. The lights dim. The crowd roars. A lone fighter steps into the ring, his presence colder than steel. In that moment, Dolph Lundgren was no longer just a man. He was Ivan Drago, the villain the world would never forget. But behind the character's icy silence was a young actor, terrified, untested, and carrying the weight of expectations he could barely comprehend. The year was 1985. Rocky IV wasn't just another movie, it was a cultural battlefield. At the height of the Cold War, East versus West wasn't just politics, it was cinema. Sylvester Stallone knew he needed more than an actor. He needed a symbol, someone who could embody the fear, the power, and the machine-like presence of the Soviet Union. When Dolph Lundgren walked into the audition, he was still virtually unknown. His experience on film amounted to little more than standing silently in the background of a James Bond scene. Yet his towering 6'5" frame, chiseled features, and piercing blue eyes immediately froze the room. Stallone knew this was Drago. For Dolph, it was overwhelming. One moment he was a student, a bodyguard, a man searching for direction. The next, he was standing across from Sylvester Stallone, about to become part of one of the most iconic film franchises in history. But stepping into Drago's shoes was no easy task. The training was brutal. Hours in the gym, sculpting his already formidable body into something near mythical. Endless rehearsals to perfect the cold, emotionless presence of a character who spoke little but said everything with his eyes. And behind the scenes, there was fear. What if he failed? What if the world laughed instead of trembled? The cameras rolled. The fight sequences were punishing, blurring the line between acting and real combat. Stallone, ever the perfectionist, pushed Dolph to the limit. During one rehearsal, a punch landed harder than expected, so hard that Stallone himself ended up in intensive care with a bruised heart. It was a chilling reminder. This was not just a movie. It was pain, sweat, and sacrifice, etched onto celluloid. When the film finally premiered, Dolph Lundgren's life changed overnight. Audiences around the world gasped at Ivan Drago, the embodiment of an unstoppable machine. His lines were few, but unforgettable. "I must break you." With those words, delivered in a voice as cold as the Siberian wind, Dolph went from obscurity to global fame. Yet fame is a double-edged sword. The world saw Ivan Drago, but few cared to see Dolph Lundgren. He was suddenly typecast as the villain, the silent giant, the foreign menace, the man behind the role, the shy boy from Stockholm, the brilliant student, the restless dreamer, was lost beneath the shadow of his own creation. And while the spotlight was blinding, it also cast long, dark shadows. Because what happens when the role that made you also begins to trap you? Fame can lift you higher than you ever dreamed, but it can also trap you in a cage you never saw coming. For Dolph Lundgren, the world's applause after Rocky IV was deafening, but soon he would realize that applause can fade, and when it does, the silence can be unbearable. After Rocky IV, Dolph Lundgren was everywhere. His face was on magazine covers, his name buzzed through Hollywood, and audiences across the globe knew him as Ivan Drago, the indestructible Soviet machine. For many, that would have been enough, to be immortalized in one iconic role. But Dolph was hungry for more. He didn't want to be remembered only as the cold villain with 3 lines. He wanted depth, recognition, the chance to prove he was more than just a towering figure with icy blue eyes. Hollywood, however, had other plans. Producers saw him as the perfect action star for the late 1980s. Big muscles, few words, explosive fights. Dolph was cast in film after film. Masters of the Universe, 1987, where he played He-Man, The Punisher, 1989, and Universal Soldier, 1992. Each role cemented his reputation as a physical powerhouse, a larger-than-life hero or anti-hero who could carry an action movie on sheer presence alone. Audiences loved the spectacle. Explosions, fists, one-liners. Dolph became a fixture of the VHS era, his movies lining the shelves of every video rental store. Yet behind the success, something was missing. Critics dismissed him as just another action figure. The industry rarely gave him scripts that allowed him to stretch, to show the intelligence and sensitivity that lived beneath the muscle. And Dolph felt the weight of it. The boy who once excelled in engineering, who could solve equations most people couldn't even read, was now boxed into roles that barely required him to speak. The trap of typecasting had closed around him. As the years passed, the landscape of cinema began to change. The golden age of muscle-bound action heroes slowly faded in the 1990s. Audiences demanded something new. Stars like Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal, once his rivals at the box office, also began to feel the shift. For Dolph, the fall was even harder. Major studio offers grew fewer, films became smaller, budgets tighter, and many of his projects went straight to video. barely noticed by the wider world. The fame that had once lifted him began to feel like a ghost, always present but no longer real. He was still working, still fighting, but the stages grew smaller, the applause quieter, and with each passing year, the shadow of Ivan Drago loomed larger, as if the world had frozen him in 1985. But Dolph Lundgren was not done. Not yet. Because beneath the fading spotlight, there was still the restless fire of a man who had spent his entire life proving people wrong. And that fire was about to take him on an unexpected journey, not just on screen, but within himself. What happens when the spotlight fades? When the crowds stop cheering and the world forgets the man it once couldn't look away from? For Dolph Lundgren, the silence after fame was louder than the applause had ever been. The 1990s were not kind to the muscle-bound heroes of the previous decade. The cinematic landscape was shifting. Audiences wanted realism, vulnerability, and complexity. The age of the invincible action titan was crumbling, and Dolph Lundgren, once at the very top, found himself caught in the collapse. He kept working, one film after another. Titles like Joshua Tree, Silent Trigger, Men of War. They came and went, most bypassing theaters altogether, landing quietly on the shelves of video stores. In the eyes of the industry, Dolph was no longer a rising star. He was a relic of an era that had already ended, and Dolph felt it. For a man who had spent his entire life pushing back against feelings of inadequacy, the fading of Hollywood's embrace cut deep. The phone calls slowed, the headlines disappeared, and suddenly, the boy who had once been invisible in his own home was invisible again, this time on the global stage. But the struggles weren't only professional. Behind closed doors, Dolph was fighting battles no camera would ever capture. The relentless pressure to remain relevant, the gnawing fear of being forgotten, the weight of expectations he could never fully meet, it all began to erode him. He faced broken relationships, loneliness, and the creeping shadow of self-doubt. At times, he turned to the wrong escapes. The glamorous parties that once thrilled him now felt hollow, yet he kept going. The roles that once excited him became routine, yet he couldn't turn them down. Every choice seemed to dig the hole deeper, and underneath it all, the question never stopped haunting him. Who am I if I am not Ivan Drago? Yet even in the darkness, there were flickers of light. Dolph had always been a fighter, not just on screen, but in life. The discipline that had carried him from a broken childhood to Hollywood's brightest stage was still inside him. And slowly, quietly, he began to realize that his greatest fight wasn't in front of a camera or against another actor in a ring. It was within himself. Because to survive, Dolph Lundgren would have to rediscover not the giant the world remembered, but the man he had always been, hidden beneath the armor. Sometimes a man has to lose everything, his fame, his pride, even himself, before he can truly begin again. For Dolph Lundgren, the fall was painful, but in the quiet aftermath, he discovered something he had never found in the spotlight: the chance to rebuild, not as a character, but as himself. By the early 2000s, Dolph Lundgren's career had reached a crossroads. The once iconic star of Rocky IV was now working far from Hollywood's bright lights, often in small-budget films filmed in distant corners of the world. To many, he had become a memory, a face from the past replayed on old VHS tapes. But away from the cameras, Dolph was fighting for something much deeper than fame. Years of typecasting, fading relevance, and personal struggles had left scars no one could see. He wrestled with loneliness, bouts of depression, and the gnawing fear that perhaps he had already given the world his best, and that it wasn't enough. Yet there was another side to him, one that had been buried beneath the muscles and the roles. He was a thinker, a problem solver, a man of discipline. Slowly, Dolph began to turn inward, to use the same determination that had once sculpted his body to now strengthen his mind and his spirit. He returned to his studies, rekindling his passion for engineering and science. He began to write, to direct, and to explore creative outlets that had nothing to do with being the villain or the action hero. For the first time in decades, Dolph was not chasing Hollywood. He was chasing himself. And something else had shifted, something far more important than career: family. Dolph became a father, and with that role came a new kind of strength. The man who had spent his entire life proving his worth to a harsh father now had daughters of his own, and for them, he wanted to be a different kind of man. Loving, present, human. It was not an easy road. The industry still saw him as a relic. Many doors remained closed, but Dolph no longer defined himself only by the applause. Slowly, piece by piece, he rebuilt. Independent films gave him the chance to experiment. Directing allowed him to tell stories in his own way. And though he was far from the mainstream spotlight, he was finding something Hollywood could never give him: peace. Yet fate wasn't finished with him. Because just when the world had all but forgotten Dolph Lundgren, a new wave of cinema was rising. A wave that looked back at the heroes of the past with fresh eyes. And soon, the man who once symbolized the Cold War on screen would return to remind the world that he had never truly left. Every fallen hero dreams of a comeback. For most, it never arrives. But for Dolph Lundgren, the man once frozen in the shadow of Ivan Drago, redemption came from an old friend and a new brotherhood of legends. The year was 2010. Hollywood was buzzing with nostalgia. Sylvester Stallone, the man who had once stood across from Dolph in the ring, was assembling a new kind of action epic: The Expendables. The concept was simple but powerful. Gather the greatest warriors of the silver screen, the icons of a bygone era, and unite them in one explosive story. For Dolph, the call felt like fate. Decades earlier, Stallone had given him his breakthrough as Ivan Drago. Now, Stallone was offering him something even more valuable: a second chance. On set, Dolph was no longer the untested young actor desperate to prove himself. He was older, scarred, weathered by years of struggle. But that weathering gave him something new: authenticity. His character, Gunnar Jensen, wasn't just another soldier of fortune. He was reckless, troubled, and unpredictable, a man fighting inner demons as much as external enemies. In many ways, Gunnar was Dolph himself. The film exploded onto screens worldwide, and so did Dolph's career. Audiences who had grown up renting his VHS tapes were thrilled to see him back, standing shoulder to shoulder with Stallone, Jason Statham, Jet Li, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Bruce Willis. The boy from Stockholm who once felt invisible was again part of Hollywood's most powerful circle. But this time, it was different. Dolph didn't carry the same desperation to prove himself. He had been to the top, he had fallen, and now he was here again. Not for validation, but for the love of the craft. He enjoyed the work, the camaraderie, the shared legacy of men who had all walked similar roads of glory and decline. The success of The Expendables spawned sequels, each giving Dolph more screen time, more layers, and more opportunities to shine. Fans cheered not just for the action, but for the return of a familiar face, one who had endured, survived, and refused to disappear. And off-screen, Dolph's life was stabilizing. He embraced fatherhood, reconnected with old passions, and allowed himself to reflect on the journey. He was no longer just Ivan Drago, no longer trapped in typecasting. He was Dolph Lundgren, an actor, a director, a father, and above all, a survivor. Yet even as he stood once again in the spotlight, there was one more chapter to be written. A chapter that would take him full circle, back to the role that had both made him and haunted him for decades. Because the world wasn't done with Ivan Drago, and neither was Dolph. Some ghosts never leave you. For Dolph Lundgren, the shadow of Ivan Drago followed him for more than 30 years. It was both his curse and his crown. And when fate brought him back to that role in Creed II, it wasn't just a return to the screen. It was a reckoning with his past. More than 3 decades had passed since Dolph first stood in the ring as Ivan Drago. The world had changed. The Cold War was long gone. The action heroes of the 80s were no longer box office kings. But when MGM announced Creed II, the next chapter in the Rocky saga, fans held their breath. Ivan Drago was coming back. For Dolph, the moment was surreal. He wasn't the young, untested actor anymore. He was older now, seasoned, carrying the weight of every battle, on screen and off. Stepping back into Drago's shoes was like staring into a mirror that reflected not just the past, but everything he had survived since. This time, Drago was no longer just a machine. He was a broken man, haunted by defeat, scarred by years of exile, desperate for redemption through his son, Victor. The role gave Dolph something he had always longed for: depth. For the first time, he could show Drago not as a symbol, but as a human being, flawed, bitter, but painfully real. Audiences were stunned. The same character who once embodied fear and destruction was now layered with regret, pride, and vulnerability. Critics praised Dolph's performance, calling it one of the most moving portrayals of his career. And for Dolph himself, it was cathartic. Playing Drago again was not just acting. It was a confrontation with his own history, his own scars. In interviews, Dolph admitted that the role forced him to revisit his personal demons, his relationship with his father, his struggles with self-worth, his years of fading fame. On screen, every look, every silence carried the weight of truth. For once, the line between character and actor disappeared. And when the film ended, Dolph Lundgren stood taller than ever before, not as Ivan Drago, not as the forgotten action star of the VHS era, but as a man who had endured, fallen, and risen again. From Stockholm to Hollywood, from silence to thunderous applause, from the shadows of failure to the light of redemption, Dolph Lundgren's story is not just about fame, it is about survival, about the strength to keep standing when the world tells you to fall. And maybe that is his greatest role of all. These stories are not just about the past, they are about the moments that shaped us all. If you want to keep walking this journey with us, there's a red subscribe button right below. Click it now and keep the memories alive.